Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Talking Central Banks podcast with me, Karan Merishi. This platform is exclusively dedicated to everything central banking, monetary economics, and policy technicals for observers across the world. Today, we will be talking about the origins of the inflation targeting regime, which we know was literally invented by the Reserve Bank of New Zealand in the 1990s and adopted by most central banks across the world, evolving into what we today call the flexible inflation targeting or FIT framework. Our guest tonight needs an introduction. He is the then Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, Murray Sherwin. Murray is an economist with over 45 years of experience in and around the New Zealand public service. He joined the Reserve Bank of New Zealand in 1976 and worked in a variety of roles, initially related to foreign exchange and domestic interest rate markets, before becoming the deputy governor between 1995 and 2001. During his time with the Reserve Bank, he spent a year at the OECD working on the Australia, Ireland, and New Zealand desk for the annual EDRC reviews. Then he was an economic advisor in the Prime Minister's Policy Advisory Group and followed by 2 years as executive director at the World Bank Group. He subsequently served as Director General and Chief Executive of the New Zealand Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. And then for 10 years, he served as the chair of the newly created New Zealand Productivity Commission. He continues to work in a variety of consultancy, advisory, and government roles. It's an absolute honor to host you on the podcast, Murray.
Karen, a pleasure. My pleasure indeed.
The pleasure is all mine, Murray. So, starting with the political side of things, Murray, you mentioned in one of your speeches that the debacles of the 1984 elections were deeply etched in the mind of Roger Douglas in the middle of 1986, eventually leading to him pushing for the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act of 1989. What were these debacles, Murray, and can you provide us with some context in this regard?
Sure. Well, some broader context, really, Karen. The New Zealand economy had been on a long, slow slide relative to the rest of the OECD, really starting from about the 1950s, from being one of the wealthier economies in the world on a per capita GDP basis. It began to slide through the 50s and 60s, and then the 70s were a very unattractive period with the oil shocks. Britain entered the European Common Market, and that closed off what had been the major outlet for our agricultural exports, and it was a difficult time for agricultural prices as well. And in that context, successive governments had supported widening fiscal deficits, and with a fixed exchange rate, widening current account deficits and increasing external debt, which was becoming a constraint on the economy more generally. Sir Robert Muldoon, it wasn't Sir Robert at that stage, but Robert Muldoon became Prime Minister in 1975, and he was a very dominant character, also Minister of Finance and Minister of anything else that happened to be going on at the time. But he became increasingly interventionist in response to this declining economic performance. Launched a series of major capital investments in the late 70s to try and diversify the economic base, a lot of them energy-based around both hydroelectric power and also some new gas fields which had been discovered offshore. They were expensive and not necessarily all successful. And by that stage, we had inflation getting up into double digits and continuing on up, so getting higher than our trading partners. Unemployment, which had typically been near zero in New Zealand for decades, had begun to creep up as well, and that was a very big political concern. In the early 80s, from about late 1982, Muldoon became very interventionist and launched a price freeze, to try and get on top of inflation while still running fiscal deficits at about 8% of GDP, and the current account deficit being a real challenge, with borrowing becoming more difficult, international borrowing. And then he followed that with wage freeze, a freeze on dividends, directors' fees, rents, anything that moved, basically. Interest rates, both borrowing and lending rates for the financial institutions were controlled. And he was trying to basically regulate his way out of a deep malaise, economic malaise. It all blew up in the middle of 1984 when Muldoon called an election as he was losing support within his own party. The foreign exchange markets assumed that, one, Muldoon was going to lose to a reformist incoming Labour government, and two, that reform would start with a devaluation of the fixed exchange rate. And as a consequence, throughout the month-long election campaign, we had a foreign currency run of some proportion. I was running the foreign exchange desk at the time and the foreign reserves desk, and it was a real battle to keep the door open, if you like. By the time we got to the election, and indeed Muldoon had lost and the reformist Labour Party was coming in, Labour government was coming in, I mean, we were bereft of foreign exchange at the central bank, and had some big obligations falling due not that far down the track. The governor of the bank at the time, Sir Spencer Russell, closed the foreign exchange markets, and there was quite a political melee as Muldoon continued to insist that he could tough it out, except he'd lost the election. And he eventually lost the support of his cabinet colleagues, and was overturned, and the new government was introduced, and the first thing that occurred was a 20% devaluation. And lo and behold, the foreign exchange returned, and we were able to open the gates and get back to business. But that was a very damaging period economically and politically, and set the scene for what was to come with this reformist Labour government. Essentially, we'd skipped a generation or two. The outgoing Muldoon government were people largely whose formative years were the Depression and World War II. The incoming government were essentially baby boomers whose formative years might have been Vietnam and other things. They were mostly professionals with independent careers. They didn't see themselves as lifelong politicians, but they did see themselves as reformers, and quite radical reformers, and found both the Treasury and the Reserve Bank and some of the other key institutions had done a lot of work on what a reformed economy might look like. So they had some ideas to bounce off, and that set the scene for what was really quite a radical, and for a policy person, a really exciting period of reform.
Right. Speaking of which, Murray, what is the essence of the relationship between central bank independence and long-run inflation, in your opinion? This is actually in the context of you saying in your speeches, and I quote, officials recommended reforms which would confer some degree of operational independence on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand.
Sure. So again, to continue from my last comments, Roger Douglas, as the new Minister of Finance, was really concerned that we find some institutional measures which would limit the prospects or the risks of a rerun of a Muldoon type situation. So he wanted to spread the decision-making authority, put some constraints on a future Prime Minister and Minister of Finance to go down the same sort of track. And one of his suggestions was that officials should go away and think about what a more independent central bank would look like, that met a number of constitutional objectives, but would provide some bulwarks against a future Minister of Finance or government running riot, if you like, with monetary policy and exchange rate policy. So that was the context within which we were set to work. I think at that stage there was a general sense that there were a lot of talk about time and consistency issues, and that politicians have incentives to play the short game, and monetary policy and inflation is a longer term game, and you need ideally some institutional arrangements which enable policy to be set with those long term objectives in mind. So that was underpinning the thinking initially as we started exploring what a more independent central bank would look like, and balancing this whole rules versus discretion debate which was running at the time as well, and providing a structure which gave ministers control and governments control of the objectives, but with a lot of transparency wrapped around that. But operational independence to the bank to get on and do its job with the longer term objectives in mind, and a lot of transparency around how that should work as well.
What can we learn from the precedent State Sector Act and Public Finance Act? In some sense, that in some sense played an important role in the coming into being of the inflation targeting regime.
Yeah, both.
And why do you say that inflation targeting evolved abruptly sometimes and was as painful as having teeth pulled out?
Well, again, the deliberations about what an independent central bank might look like were taking place in the context of some major reforms to public sector management in New Zealand. Part of it was the State Sector Act, which you mentioned, and that essentially took a fairly traditional Westminster-style public service and said an arrangement whereby we have quite a centralised public service with a State Services Commission at the top, which appoints the secretaries of the departments, the chief executives of the departments, often on seniority or whatever, dictates the salaries and conditions across the public service, moves public servants between agencies and all of that, and it's a job for life. Basically turned that upside down and said, well, we're going to have appointments on merit at the top. They may or may not come from within the public sector. They may or may not come from within New Zealand. So we've had in a number of the Treasury's had 2 or 3 non-residents appointed as secretaries to the Treasury. The newly appointed chief executives, who will be on a 5-year contract with essentially a contract between their relative ministers and themselves as to what is to be delivered over time. And once appointed, the chief executives will have authority to appoint the people they regard as necessary and required and best for the various roles they have. They'll be able to determine for themselves salaries and conditions and wages within their agencies. So it was a much more, I use the term, I think, in those speeches, managerialist approach to running the public service, sort of trying to mirror some of the dynamics that you see in the private sector. Alongside that was also the Public Finance Act, which was really, again, based on transparency and based on shifting public sector accounting into again, a more private sector familiar style. So the introduction of accrual accounting, clear definitions between and distinctions between current spending and capital spending, and getting away from cash flow accounting in budget processes to these capital and current distinctions, and specified targets, ministers being required to specify targets for debt to GDP ratios out in the long term, and discussions of how they're going to get there. And all of that published and with requirements to be reported against it. The Treasury was also obliged to put out longer term fiscal projections, so bringing in demographics and other factors and putting out 10 and 15 and 20 year projections as to how the public accounts might emerge under current policies, and giving early indications of where things needed to move. So all of that sort of thinking was at large, if you like, as we began to think about what an independent central bank might look like and how that might be worked. And out of that came things like a governor who is on the government, the ministers pick the inflation outcome they want and other objectives they might have in mind and write that into a contract with the governor who's on a 5-year contract.
Right.
A board of directors which is set up largely to monitor the performance of the governor. And so that sort of structure was sort of common around the public sector and seemed pretty natural to start to flow that into our thinking about the Reserve Bank. But still, you want some independence. So rather than operating on, as the government agencies do, government departments operate on a year-to-year appropriation, we wanted a 5-year funding agreement, which we have, and a number of other elements to reinforce the independence as well.
So in this context, Murray, it's a very interesting topic. This managerialistic approach that in public sector that you mentioned, and that basically ushered inflation targeting in New Zealand in the late 1980s and early 90s. Uh, do you think without this approach, the FIT regime would not have been successfully implemented in New Zealand?
I think the institutional framework was important to that. And certainly, Don Brash was appointed as governor after the act had been passed, actually, or about the time the act was passed. So he hadn't had much or any engagement in the design of the act and the way that we sort of happened upon inflation targeting, almost sort of accidentally in a sense. So he hadn't had much engagement with that, but he certainly took the policy targets agreement, his employment contract, as he referred to it, very, very seriously. And that became a key part of what was a very vigorous public communications program. He was convinced, as ministers and the rest of us were, that shifting inflation expectations amongst the public and the business community and unions and others was a really important part of trying to lower the cost of lowering inflation, if you like, lowering the whole transition process. And he was a very vigorous public speaker, out and about, and talking that story constantly and making quite a play on the fact that, look, I've got a contract. This is what I have to deliver, and my job depends on it. So all of that framework, I think, became an important part of the narrative. Could you have done it without it? Well, yes, I guess you could have, but it was an element that worked for us at the time.
Right. So speaking on the PTA, was the contract of the governor, which we call the policy targets agreement, that was based on his ability to achieve price stability, related to this managerialistic approach to the public sector?
Yes, I mean it flowed out of that, the nature of a contract and the transparency. It's a published contract, so
Right.
you're putting all of this stuff out, and there's quite a lot of reputational and other risk that hangs on that. So yeah, it was all consistent with that sort of approach. You'll note that the early ones were a bit tortuous. I was rereading the first one last night, and it's quite tortuous about where we might have exceptions and allowances and all the rest of it. The latter ones are much shorter and sharper, and that's consistent with moving from a very sort of tightly specified inflation target to something which is a bit more, expecting to hit a target over the cycle and over time.
Right. Moving to the technical policy side, Murray, was the monetary-based measure that was initially decided to be based on a relationship between a particular output and an ultimate output as a proxy for price stability, somewhat related to output gap? If so, I was a bit confused about the proxy and output gap. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to have some of your opinion on that.
Yeah. Let me step back a bit because I think, again, I said in some of my speeches that there was a sense of some frustrated monetarists around the Reserve Bank and the Treasury. So as we were designing the Reserve Bank Act and the framework that might work, and thinking about how you set up a target for the bank, there was a strong presumption, I think, amongst many as we went into that we would end up with some sort of a monetary or aggregate or credit aggregate target as the instrument, the policy instrument. And I think some thought that they could simply say to the governor in the policy target agreement, yes, the long-term objective is price stability over the long term, and you'll do that by hitting X% growth on some credit or money aggregate. Problem was we couldn't find a money or credit aggregate that had any sort of stable relationship with nominal GDP or any other relevant final outcome that we were interested in. And conscious also of the sort of the Goodhart's law approach that, when you try to work on any of those, the relationship falls apart. And we've been going backwards and forwards on how to sort of set up an operating framework. And I recall the meeting where there'd been all the debates about which instruments to use, which aggregates or whatever might be possible, and what other approaches might be possible. And Arthur Grimes, who might be known to some of your people, who's probably one of our most prominent economists and was in the Reserve Bank at the time, subsequently became chair of the board. Arthur was sitting there quietly and finally said, look, what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve price stability. So instead of all of this debate about the intermediate targets and so forth, why don't we just go straight to price stability? And you can see a sort of light bulbs going off around the room. And then a discussion about, well, how would you do that? Well, you've got your forecasts, and you vary policy as necessary to get you to the target that's been specified. And so it all began to sort of flow from there in terms of the framework and the policy targets agreement, with the government setting the inflation target and the bank being given discretion, authority to act as necessary to achieve it and being held accountable for achieving it. But importantly, the specification of the target lies with the government. So that's the link back to the elected representatives, if you like. There was still, having got to that step when it came to implementation, there was still an aversion, I think, amongst some of my colleagues at the time to setting any prices, including interest rates. They were still sort of quantity based. And because there was so much going on in the New Zealand economy, because by that stage we were into wholesale restructuring of government agencies and privatisation and corporatisation and just really, really big structural changes. We'd floated the exchange rate and removed capital controls and all sorts of other things. So it was an economy in a state of flux at that point. So there was a sense that, well, we don't want to tie down prices because they've got an important role to play, and as I said, a preference for trying to find a quantity that could act as the driving point for monetary policy. Initially, we used as we got into this regime, essentially the settlement balances of the banks with the central bank, and targeted those and could put more or less pressure on those settlement balances to push interest rates up or down without having to set interest rates. It was a kind of an untidy mechanism, and it worked, or we could make it work. There was a lot of I was running the operational end of the bank at that stage, and spent a lot of time talking with the treasurers of the banks and the others in the marketplace to clarify exactly what we were wanting to see as the outcomes from all of this. So there was a lot of that sort of discussion going on, and it was not a particularly satisfactory approach. We had a brief flirtation with a monetary conditions index. That was a very unsatisfying and unsatisfactory exposure. And that was because the exchange rate had become a major load bearer in the whole monetary transmission process, and that was pretty tough on our exporters, particularly some of the farmers who were finding that very difficult. They'd had a very rough time through the transition as interest rates had gone up, farm prices had collapsed, and an elevated exchange rate was just further. This was the pulling teeth part of it. Some very painful adjustments taking place at that point. The monetary conditions index was designed to try and pull inflation, interest rates, and exchange and the exchange rate into a sort of a composite index of the degree of monetary policy pressure being applied at the time. But it was unsatisfactory because the exchange rate would kick around quite a lot, which meant that interest rates would kick around a lot, and I think it was really just muddying everything. It took a while to get everybody on board, but we finally got to just let's go to a conventional overnight cash rate basis. I mean, that's the thing that we can control and should take responsibility for it. And having got there, I think it's worked a whole lot better, and the implementation end of policy is much more straightforward.
We'll talk about the cash rate, Murray, in the later questions. But in hindsight, how effective was Douglas's apparent guiding of inflation expectations in the 0 to 1% range, which was to be achieved in a couple of years on live television in 1988? Were the households, unions, and corporations positively surprised as he expected them to be at that time?
Yeah, I think everybody was surprised. I mean, Roger Douglas at the time said, "Look, in an interview, look, we don't. Inflation's bad. We want to get to price stability. Price stability seems like 0 on the CPI or maybe 1%, somewhere in that range." None of us had heard that before, and I think it was fairly off the cuff on his part as well. But he was wanting to communicate to the wider public that price stability meant price stability, and he was serious about it, and he had a track record of demonstrating that what he was serious about, he tended to achieve. When we took that into thinking about what an appropriate target was for the first policy targets agreement, there was a sense that, well, there's a bit of bias in CPI measurement, so 1% is probably close to true 0. You need a bit of flex around that, so 0 to 2 sort of dropped out and was accepted. Roger Douglas had by that stage resigned as Minister of Finance, and it was David Cagle who came in and signed that initial contract, I think. And 0 to 2 was there. Inflation at that point was running at 5 to 6 to 7%, somewhere in that range. It had come a long way down from the 15 to 20. And we'd gone through some big shocks along the way. I mean, the introduction of VAT, or GST as we call it, at first at 10% and then at 12.5%, had given a big kick. The devaluation initially had given a big kick. There were a lot of user charges coming out of the newly privatized or corporatized government-owned operations, the SOEs and elsewhere. So there was quite a lot of price adjustment taking place across the economy. On the other hand, the tax system had been completely reformed, and much lower marginal tax rates on incomes and so on. So a lot was going on, and getting to 0 to 2 still seemed like quite a stretch when we were down to 5, 6, 7, that sort of level. I remember a particular meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee where Don Brash sort of put his hand up and said to the group around the table, these were all officials of the Reserve Bank at the time, I have a sense, he said, that not everyone is confident that we're going to get to 0 to 2. Hands up if you don't think we're going to get there in our targeted time. And probably half, including me, put our hands up. It didn't seem like that was going to be plausible at the time. And he said, well, there's the door. If you're not on board, you are welcome to leave, because I've got a contract which says I've got to get to 0 to 2, and I'm going to do it. And that was the line he took publicly as well. So in fact, I think we got there. There was a small extension of the target date, but we got there within the target time.
As you mentioned, Murray, David Cahill eventually announced the 0 to 2% target range in the 89 budget officially. So I reckon that there was apparently a government acceptance soon after, given that the 89 Act was passed in the parliament without a vote of dissent. So what are your views on this?
Well, the Act was certainly passed without a vote of dissent. Don Brash has often pointed out that Rob Muldoon, who was still in Parliament, was in hospital at the time and
Yeah.
would almost certainly have voted against it had he been in the Parliament that night. But it's also true that both the major parties in Parliament, the National Party, sort of you can think of roughly as sort of old style British Conservatives, and the Labour Party, which as Labour parties are, both of them had quite a lot of dissent within their caucuses, and they'd had to have some quite difficult discussions in their caucus rooms before
Right.
they were all told they were going to vote for this. So they did. So yes, having that unanimous vote was important, but it would be wrong to think that everybody in the Parliament thought this was a great idea. There was a lot of concern about the single target on inflation, and was that going to cause mayhem in employment and product markets, and shouldn't we be
Right.
taking a little more concern about wider economic stability and well-being? Um,
Mm.
yeah, so that was the context of that discussion.
Right. Murray, can you talk about the statement in one of your speeches, and I quote, reservations about the new framework were also evident in submissions made to the Select Committee, which considered the bill. In more detail, especially Clause 8I of the bill.
Yeah, this is 20, 25, 30 years ago, so I've
Right.
struggled with all of the
Yeah.
recollections. But that was really the one around this, the
Mm,
single objective
mm,
of price stability, and others would have wanted that moderated. And I'm thinking particularly some of the union groups, some of the industry groups, perhaps,
mm.
and business groups might have wanted a wider specification and to include output stability and employment and other objectives in the target. Um, I think being clear that monetary policy can affect inflation and in the long term can't do it, and that's the best thing that it can do in the long term is to achieve price stability, is the best
Yes.
way to achieve positive outcomes on the other objectives that we had in mind.
Mm,
That argument holds true. I think it still holds true, which doesn't mean to say that you can't have a bit of sort of flex as you go through, particularly in an economy like New Zealand, which is quite small, quite narrow, quite volatile. So you've got to be able to look through some of the shocks and surprises that come along.
Speaking of which, Murray, how effective has the PTA been in managing price stability in line with Otto Niemeyer convictions brought forward in his 1931 report, which was for the establishment of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand?
Yeah, I put that reference to Namir when he first did his assessment of whether New Zealand needed a central bank. The Bank of England was doing quite a bit of that in other countries, and
Yeah.
but it's a sort of a classical statement from him about what a central bank should do, and that's protect
Mm,
the value of its currency,
right.
and which is just another way of saying price stability, in my view. So that was a fairly conventional and straightforward way of expressing the objectives of the bank when it was first set up. I mean, the bank was first created just prior to the war, World War II, but really didn't get underway operationally until beyond World War II. Um, and really didn't have any operational independence at any stage on the way through, with a fixed exchange rate and all the way through that period, and capital controls and so on.
Right.
There was no independent monetary policy. There was a bit of occasional uh, steps to modify government borrowing programs to manage bank liquidity and so on. But it was
Right.
not an independent central bank in any sense of the word prior to the float of the currency.
Right. Murat, former Fed Governor Ben Bernanke, in one of his speeches, said that by imposing a conceptual structure and its inherent discipline on the central bank, but without eliminating all flexibility, inflation targeting basically combines some of the advantages traditionally ascribed to rules with those ascribed to discretion. I know you did talk about discretion, but this perhaps leads to the rules versus discretion debate that you allude to in your speeches often. Can you elaborate on this? And where does the inflation targeting framework truly represented within these two extremities? You can maybe touch upon inflation forecast targeting description that also became important in the debate.
Sure. Well, I think in the early days when we were trying to get on top of what had become an entrenched inflationary cycle and an entrenched inflationary psychology, there wasn't a heck of a lot of room for much flexibility if you were going to achieve that outcome. And that goes back to the way that Don Brash approached his role as governor and making it clear to people that you may think I'm mad, but this is the target, this is the contract I've signed that I'm going to deliver on it.
Right.
And as I said, that was really very deliberately built around trying to shift those expectations of future inflation to make the disinflationary process easier. And so I think I used the term in one of my speeches also that we tended to treat the bounds, the outer bounds of the 0 to 2 and subsequently 0 to 3 range as electric fences, to use a good agricultural term. You know, you approach but don't
Right.
touch. So over time, as we've settled into a much lower inflation environment, still a bit of a battle at times to stay down at the sort of the 2% midpoint or wherever. I think the whole system has become just a little bit more relaxed around the edges and a little more willing to contemplate shocks moving through and economic cycles coming and going and inflation moving a bit within or near targets without feeling a need to react vigorously. More recently, I mean, and we're not totally on a different planet on all of this, because our inflation outcomes are affected by what goes on in the rest of the world as well. So we need to watch that. I mean, I've always been a bit of a fan for being not too hard-edged about these things. Again, to go back to my earlier comments, I think we're a small, narrow economy. There's not a lot of momentum in the New Zealand economy. It can bounce up and bounce down in terms of growth performance quite quickly. And monetary policy can sort of help steady it and stabilize on the way through. I don't think my style is not to get too carried away with a highly activist monetary policy. I just don't think our capacity to forecast and to manage policy and understand exactly all of what's going on is sufficiently deep or subtle, actually, to enable us to do that effectively. So I tend to be a little more, let's sort of lean against the what seem to be the prevailing pressures, but not be too precise about it. You mentioned Lars Svensson, who did a review of monetary policy here in the late 90s, and he, in a nice little piece, said, "Well, you're not really inflation targeting; you're targeting inflation forecasts," which is true.
Right.
because the forecasting is an important part of is a critical part of the process. So
Correct.
you're
Yeah.
looking out ahead, seeing where your forecasting is pointing in terms of the inflationary pressures and momentum. And if your forecasts are taking you above target, then you also project a trend in monetary policy pressure, which is designed to pull you back into the
Mm.
range or up into
Right.
the range, as the case may be. So yeah, I mean, inflation targeting is, I think, inevitably inflation forecast targeting as you
Yeah.
operationalize it.
Exactly. Talking about the rest of the world, Murray, several global central banks of nations such as India, South Korea, Chile, Israel, Mexico also call themselves inflation targeters. But apparently, they do not have an explicit public commitment, as you often point out in your speeches and commentaries. In your view, are countries with or without such commitments successful in inflation targeting?
Um, Look, I'm not that familiar with some of those central banks and how they're operating these days. There was a time when I was. Um, it does seem to me that if you're going to call yourself an inflation targeter, you really need to be quite transparent about what the target is, how
Right.
you're going to meet it, and quite transparent about reporting against your progress.
Mm.
Without that, then you're short on an anchor, and you're short on an anchor which ties into inflationary expectations in the wider community. And I think
Right.
that's an important part of it. Which doesn't mean to say that you can't run monetary policy successfully without those elements of inflation targeting. I mean, people do it in all sorts of ways, and they have done over the years.
Mm.
But there needs to be some disciplines and some structured frameworks, I think, to be successful over the long term.
Right. Can you talk about the significance of expanding of the inflation horizon under the regime of FIT from 4 quarters to 8 quarters in detail? Were there any macroeconomic consequences of this change, More?
Um, yeah, I'm trying to remember quite the context on which in which that happened, and I don't think we see that as terribly significant here. Again, our inflation forecasting capacities were evolving over time as as the economy settled down in its new framework, and some of the massive restructurings and so forth settled down, and our own inflation forecasting technology improved, models got better, and so on, and data got better. It And I think looking a little further ahead tends to I think maybe even stabilize a little your
Right.
policy reaction functions. So I don't see that as having been enormously significant in terms of the way we thought about the model we were running and how we were trying to do it. It was,
Right.
can we look a little further out? Does that give us a bit more stability or not?
Yeah. Also, can you shed some light on the evolution of the OCR? I think we did talk about that about this a bit earlier, or the official cash rate
Mm.
over the years, and in the importance along with the observations of exchange rate in inflation targeting.
Yeah. So we finally, as I mentioned earlier, moved to what is a fairly conventional, overnight cash rate
Mm.
target and operating mechanism, and have used that successfully since. In the early days, again with a small economy and an open float, the currency was kicking around a lot. It went through a big range. There was a lot of volatility internationally at that time as well.
Mm.
So the exchange rate was carrying a lot of the weight of the transmission of monetary policy,
Mm.
and uh, causing some really quite severe stresses in parts of the exposed sector, the export sector in particular. So we worried a lot about how we could manage monetary policy, or if we could manage monetary policy while moderating some of those exchange rate pressures. There were a number of exercises, again, Don Brash initiated research programs around other instruments that we might be able to introduce that would moderate the impact of the monetary policy pressure on the exchange rate. Very few of those turned out, or nothing there turned out to be terribly attractive as we looked at it. And I think it's the case that over time, foreign exchange markets have become a little more stable of late. The New Zealand dollar, having kicked around a lot in the early years of the float, has settled down quite a lot now. And you know, if you look at the cross rate against the Australian dollar, it's been reasonably stable. In fact, surprisingly stable in my view for a long time. And against the US dollar also, it sort of moves through a range, but not that dramatic. So I think that is less of an issue now than it was when we first started the process. It may come back to be an issue again in the future, but who knows, depending on what happens internationally.
So if I'm not mistaken, Murray, the OCR is a non-collateralized overnight rate in the money market, or is it something else?
It's the balances of well, it applies to the balances of the commercial banks as held at the central bank. And tends to be the key upon which they put their own lending and borrowing rates in the marketplace. So the OCR comes down by 25 basis points, and mortgage interest rates might drop even in advance if there's a widespread confidence that the next adjustment is down. So that sort of moves its way through the system. Through the COVID era, there's been a huge amount of quantitative easing, and now we're into quantitative tightening and trying to sort of unwind the big balances in the central bank and the big balances sitting in the exchange settlement accounts, the accounts of the commercial banks with the central bank. So that's a different setting, but it hasn't got in the way of the way that policy is being implemented in a mechanical sense. But there's quite an interesting task there to unwind some of those consequences post-COVID still, and we're not alone in that.
Well, what is the policy experience, Murray, in the design and implementation of strict and flexible inflation targeting, in your opinion? The latter seems to be a central bank favorite around the world. What are your views on that?
Well, as I think I've already mentioned, in an economy like ours, and I think a degree of flexibility is both necessary and desirable. Because we're a bit vulnerable to quite a lot of volatility of one sort or another. The degree to which one can use that flexibility, though, I think hangs a lot on the credibility of the decision makers at the central bank. You misuse it at your peril, and you can exploit it for a while. But if it looks like it's getting in the way of your achievement of ultimate targets, then that discretion has become unhealthy, and it's likely to drive you back to a stricter regime.
Right. And what about the judgments that have become the pillars of inflation targeting, Murray? And why is the narrower range found out to be better, in your opinion?
Well, yeah, I don't think there's a settled debate, and there's unlikely to be a settled debate on exactly what specification of the range or whether it's even a point. It seems to me almost a matter of taste rather than anything which is analytically tractable.
Right.
I think the target needs to be close enough to price stability, real price stability, that inflation and future inflation are not influencing judgments on borrowing and investment and behavior of people and businesses in the community. And that's
Right.
what you're after is that inflation sort of ceases to be an obvious and high consideration in the decisions of actors in the economy. Yeah, I think you can address it in all sorts of different ways, express it in all sorts of different ways but so long as it's effective in anchoring those expectations.
Given that television played such an important role in the early implementation of inflation targeting, Murray, can you talk about the importance of communications in the FIT's implementation
Yeah,
and
yeah.
what have been the learnings over the years?
Well, again, to go back to Don Brash as governor, he was a very enthusiastic and active communicator. He spent a lot of time as deputy governor. There was almost a sort of a outside governor, inside governor thing. He was out on the road seeking audiences to talk to, and he did a huge amount of speaking up and down the countryside to different groups. To talk about the framework, why it mattered, and the rationale behind it, and to convey his sense to the rest of the community that this is a target that I've got, and I'm serious about it, and I'm going to achieve it. And the quicker we do it, the better, and the more you believe, the quicker you believe that I'm going to do it, the easier it will be. So he did an enormous amount of that sort of thing, and we looked a lot at different channels to communicate through. Everything from running essay competitions for students to big conferences and set piece speeches to small community groups. It turned out that nothing worked. Again, small economy, you can do this sort of stuff, I guess, but nothing worked better than standing a senior Reserve Bank official up in front of an audience face to face. And often my sense was, because I did a lot of it as well, my sense was the audience was often less interested in exactly what the message was you were giving, and more likely to be sitting there forming a judgment about would I trust this person or not. And I think that's sort of part of the communications story is being credible and appearing authoritative and appearing to know what you know, to know what you're doing, so that they can have confidence in you. And so we just put a huge store on that and just kept on working at it.
I know you did talk about this earlier, Murray, but what were the implications of the abandonment of the quantity-based structure and eventually the final decision favoring the overnight cash rate targeting, as we just talked about? You can perhaps touch upon the frustrated monetarism that you mentioned earlier, the phenomenon in your speeches.
Yeah. Look, I think by the time we'd got to the point of deciding that we really needed to get off the various settlement cash targets and other targets we'd used as our implementation mechanism, by the time we got to the point of deciding that we really needed to move on to the OCR framework, there was there was not much sympathy left for that sort of money base and quantity type framework. It had just proved too difficult. So within the bank and within the financial sector, I think the move to the OCR was just cleaner, more transparent. It was a clearer story to communicate, and it was more stable. So there weren't too many tears shed at that point.
What has been the New Zealand experience in inflation targeting over the years, Murray? Also, what are the lessons learned during the implementation of the framework as you saw over the years?
Oh, well, I think the pieces that remain sort of truisms, if you like, are that monetary policy should be targeted at inflation, that price
Mm,
stability matters, and we've seen pressures on that of late, and it's not a good
mm,
place to be. I mean, there's quite a lot of community angst right now about cost of living issues, which uh, come through with energy prices and food prices here over the last little while. And a framework that enables you to clearly and transparently uh, communicate and implement
mm.
policy is important. I don't think anyone here gets too hung up on exactly what form that takes, but we've got something which is working, has been shown to work,
Right.
and there's not a lot of incentive at this stage to change it further. Um, which doesn't mean to say that there aren't people who would still like to see monetary policy targeted at lowering unemployment
Mm,
or boosting growth a little further or whatever. So, you know, these things are never exact, never precise. But the framework, I think, with the emphasis on transparency and accountability and clarity of objectives and so on, I think is has served us well and can continue to serve us well. It needs a fiscal policy which is similarly attuned to good outcomes and a broader policy settings as well, and competition policy and a variety of other elements of public policy are really important and still need to be worked on.
interesting. Finally, Murray, I know we have talked about this earlier, but maybe in more detail. Has the independence of the central bank ever been an issue, in your opinion, given that more legislative scrutiny is built into the governor's PTA?
Um, Look, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said no. But
Okay.
we've had no. There's never been any threat to that independence. There is an enormous amount of scrutiny in the sense that the governor and the bank are regularly in front of select committees of the parliament to be cross-examined on policy, whether it's prudential policy, which is a big part of the bank's operations now, or monetary policy, or other aspects of financial stability. We've had an unfortunate episode over the last 6 or 8 months where the last governor has resigned suddenly, and now the chair of the board also, and that's to do with arguments or disagreements over the funding agreement for the bank. The bank has grown enormously in numbers, which is again a
Mm,
sharp divergence from where Don Brash was.
right.
And spending has increased at a time when the public sector is under quite a lot of pressure to pull back its spending generally. So the previous governor, Adrian Orr, resigned, 3 or 4 months ago, suddenly. We have an acting governor in place right now. And the handling of that departure and the communication of the reasons, which was in the hands of the then chair of the board, was seen to be not well done. And so the chair of the board has resigned also. So we have an acting chair and an acting governor right now. Uh, in that context, I think that not well. The point I would take is that ministers mostly have been, and the wider bureaucracy have been, mostly been concerned to ensure that they acted in a way that preserved the integrity of the independence
Mm,
against some stresses. And I think with the right appointments, we'll be back on track, and there won't be reason to question it. But it just tells you how quickly institutional frameworks can unravel in circumstances which are not compatible with with ongoing trust and confidence.
Right. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for the time, Murray. It's been an absolute honor to host you on the podcast.
Well, my pleasure, and I hope you and your listeners find that useful.
I'm sure they would. Thank you very much, Murray.
Thank you.